Welcome back to Killer Stories. I'm your host, Bobby Holmes. This is part 2 of this season's finale, The Black Dahlia. If you are here today but haven't listened to part 1 yet, press pause and go back. In part 1, I covered the life of Elizabeth Short and her grisly murder. In today's episode, I'm going to talk about who done it, or at least who I think is responsible, as well as how this crime has influenced pop culture. We left off with a reporter calling Elizabeth's mother, Phoebe Sawyer. They duped her into giving information about her daughter by saying she won a beauty contest. At the end of the call, they broke the news. Elizabeth didn't win a beauty contest. She had been brutally murdered. The case was huge, and every media outlet was trying to write the best front page story, even if it was at the expense of Phoebe's emotions. It's hard enough to get news like this, but from a reporter? Elizabeth's father, Cleo, was paid a visit by police. They informed him of his daughter's death, but he didn't react as you would expect. He didn't seem saddened or upset. He just made sure they knew he had an alibi. Cleo said he had not seen Elizabeth since he kicked her out of the house 3 years prior. He had his boss vouch for him that he was working during the suspected time of her murder. He went on to tell police that she was involved with many men, which unfortunately painted the picture of Elizabeth being, well, I would use the word promiscuous, but in the 40s, they said a whore. However, the definition of a whore is trading sex for money, which I don't believe was the case. I mean, it's good to lay down the facts as not to be targeted as a suspect, but geesh, show some respect for your own flesh and blood. A newspaper article came out claiming her recent love life had transformed her from an innocent girl to a black-clad, man-crazy delinquent known as the Black Dahlia. Talk about victim shaming. The LAPD put out a special bulletin asking for information regarding Elizabeth, or Beth, Short, between the dates of January 9th and January 15th, 1947. The description given was: female, American, 22 years old, 5'6", 118 pounds, black hair, green eyes, very attractive. Follows up the very attractive description with bad lower teeth and fingernails chewed to the quick. Subject readily makes friends with both sexes and frequented cocktail bars and night spots. All the men in Elizabeth's life were eliminated as suspects one at a time, including the sergeant that she previously lived with that abused her. He was deployed overseas at the time of her murder. Red Manley was tracked down and brought in for questioning. He said while in San Diego, the two went out to dinner and then dancing at a nightclub. He hadn't seen her since he dropped her off that day at the Biltmore Hotel, and he claimed they never had sex. He told police that he didn't come forward with this information because he didn't want his wife to find out that he took another woman out on the town. He admits that he had an infatuation with Elizabeth, but he would never do anything to hurt her. Like many unsolved murder cases, people called in and falsely confessed they were the murderer, a phenomena I will never understand. But then a call comes in to the editor of the Examiner. The man on the other line says, "I'll send you some things that she had with her when she, shall we say, disappeared. See how far you can get with them. And now I must say goodbye. You may be trying to trace this call." At first, they assumed this was just a hoax like all the previous calls, but the very next day, a manila envelope arrived addressed to the Los Angeles Medical Examiner. Inside was a paper with newspaper clippings glued together to create the message, "Here is Dahlia's belongings. Letter to follow." Along with this message was Elizabeth Short's Social Security card, birth certificate, pictures of her with various men, and an address book. Suspiciously, a page had been ripped out of the address book, meaning potentially Elizabeth knew her killer and he removed the page with his name on it. A few days later, the letter showed up. It was actually a postcard, and this time the killer did not try to disguise his writing using newspaper clippings. He wrote it in ballpoint pen. which is an important fact because in 1947, ballpoint pens were fairly new and pretty expensive, costing around $12.50 a piece. That's the equivalent of $125 today. Could you imagine paying $125 for a ballpoint pen? Because they were so expensive, they were primarily used by the wealthy, doctors, lawyers, business executives, etc. The postcard read, "Here it is, turning in Wednesday, January 29th at 10 a.m. Had my fun with police. Black Dahlia Avenger." A public reply was sent to the killer via the LA Daily. "If you want to surrender, indicated by the postcard now in our hands, I will meet you at any public location at any time or at the homicide detail office in the city hall. Communicate immediately by phone or mail." But the day the killer said he would turn himself in came and went. He didn't show. But more cut and paste letters came, one stating he would turn himself in for the killing if he only got 10 years. Then another letter came that said, "Changed my mind. You wouldn't give me a square deal. Dahlia killing justified." It was not known 100% that these last few letters were sent from the actual killer. It could have been someone trying to insert themselves into the investigation, or even someone from the media trying to keep the story going. The only one that for sure seemed to be the killer was the manila envelope that included her belongings. The killer never reached back out, but that doesn't mean the investigation stopped. Over the years, there were many potential suspects, which we are going to dive into now. The Black Dahlia case was thought to be linked to the Cleveland torso killer. Her murder had a lot in common with the unsolved murders in Cleveland. Dismemberment, dumped in a public place, and the killer seemed to have medical knowledge. Did the killer relocate to LA and murder Elizabeth Short? Probably not. There was a 10-year gap between the killings in Cleveland and the Black Dahlia. Also, all the victims killed by the torso killer were decapitated. Elizabeth's face and skin was mutilated, but she was only dissected at the waist. The victims of the torso killer were prostitutes and drifters. While Elizabeth was pretty much homeless, she was well known in the area and didn't fit that profile. I mentioned earlier that some people falsely confessed to the murder, one being a woman named Christine Reynolds. She claimed that her and Elizabeth were romantically involved. Christine said they had been dating for weeks when Elizabeth broke things off to be with another woman. This caused Christine to snap and kill her. Now, Elizabeth very well may have been bisexual, but that was never confirmed. And honestly, it's no one's business but hers. But of course, this put the media into an even bigger frenzy. Christine's story didn't exactly line up with the facts of the case, but she did come forward with one thing that was never released to the public. Christine said after she killed Elizabeth, she cut off some of her hair, and there is no real nice way to say this, she shoved it into her vagina. This sparked the interest of investigators because it was not common knowledge. But it turns out that a female friend working for the LAPD shared this information with Christine, and she used it in part of her false confession. Another suspect we already touched on, Red Manley. He was the last person known to interact with Elizabeth, and at one point he was actually arrested, but there was no real evidence pointing to him as the killer, and he was released. Next on the suspect list was Leslie Dillon, a 24-year-old bellhop working at a hotel in downtown LA. He didn't come to light in the investigation until almost a year after Elizabeth's murder. A letter was written to an LAPD psychiatrist using the alias Jack Sands. The purpose of this letter was to point the police in the direction of a man named Jeff Connors. Jack Sands claimed that he saw Jeff and Elizabeth together on multiple occasions. Following the discovery of Elizabeth Short's body, Jeff skipped town. Investigators did look into this Jeff Connors character, but were not convinced he was involved. Instead, they looked closely at the man writing the letters, Jack Sands. He had weirdly shared the fact that he was a sexual sadist, police figured out that Jack Sands was actually Leslie Dillon. Evidence found in his apartment backed up the sexual sadist claim. Leslie had clipped articles from newspapers that involved sexual violence against women. 2 blocks from Leslie's apartment was a cafe where Elizabeth's shoes and purse had been dumped. And the vacant lot where her body was discovered, that was an area Leslie walked by daily on his way to and from work. Even more damning, Leslie had been arrested before. He was a pimp, well, formerly a pimp, and he had previously worked as a mortician's assistant. The clean dissection and draining of blood would make sense for this line of work. He frequently stayed at a place called the Astor Hotel. During the investigation into Leslie Dillon, police interviewed the owner of the hotel, and he came forward with some chilling evidence. In the week Elizabeth Short was unaccounted for, January 9th through the 15th, a young woman with dark hair was spotted at the hotel, but she seemed to be out of it, almost like she was drugged. After the 15th, she was gone. The room she was staying in was covered in blood and feces. Another little known fact, not only did the killer put some of Elizabeth's hair in her vagina, but they also forced her to eat feces. This room at the Astor Hotel is looking like it was the place where Elizabeth Short was murdered. But why would the owner of the hotel not have come forward with this information sooner? Well, he was recently arrested for a domestic dispute with his wife and didn't want to inject himself into this. He wanted to keep his distance from police. I understand that, but this isn't about you, dude. With the dark-haired girl, witnesses said they also saw a dark-haired man that fit the description of Leslie Dillon. He is beginning to look like the prime suspect for this murder. But even with all this information stacked against him, it was all circumstantial evidence, and nothing was strong enough to actually charge Leslie. Next on the list of suspects is 55-year-old Mark Hansen. He was the owner of a nightclub in Hollywood, one that Elizabeth frequented. He knew that she didn't have much money and offered Elizabeth a place to stay. In his mind, he thought this kindness would be returned with sexual favors, but Elizabeth turned him down. That didn't go over well with Mark, and he kicked her out. Before long, Elizabeth was back on his doorstep begging for help as she had nowhere else to go. The two became infatuated with each other, even though they both continued to see other people. Mark once brought another woman home, and Elizabeth supposedly flew into a jealous rage and got into a fist fight with the woman. Mark also dabbled in illegal activities such as prostitution, drugs, racketeering, and illegal abortion clinics. He had attended medical school in Denmark before moving to the States. Remember, police believed Elizabeth's killer was a medical professional due to the surgical precision used to dissect her. Suspiciously, Mark actually ran in the same circle as Leslie Dillon. They were both part of a local gang that worked together to rob hotel safes. This is how it worked. One of the gang members would be hired as a bellhop. The bellhop would find where the hotel keeps their safe and then quit. Days later, the gang would return to rob the hotel. Elizabeth was thought to have been involved with some of these gang members. Perhaps they thought she knew too much about this operation, and that is why she was killed. Witnesses who reported the dark-haired woman at the Astor Hotel also noted a man staying in the room next to her. He fit the exact description of Mark Hansen, including a foreign accent. Did Mark Hansen and Leslie Dillon work together to kill Elizabeth? As the investigation against these men ramped up, it was suddenly shut down. As it turns out, Mark Hansen did some illegal dealings with corrupt cops on the LAPD force. They put a stop to this lead, and nothing more ever came of it. Mark Hansen also owned a Lincoln dealership in LA. Suspiciously, after he was no longer considered a suspect, the LAPD officers working the Dahlia case were all driving new Lincolns. Coincidence? I think not. Now for the last suspect I'm going to cover, George Hodel. George was born and raised in the Los Angeles area of California. His family was quite wealthy. He was very intelligent with an IQ of 186. Even as a youngster, he was considered a pianist, musical prodigy. I always struggle with the word pianist. He played the piano. George graduated high school early at the age of 15 and attended the California Institute of Technology, or Caltech. But he didn't make it past his first year, not because he struggled academically, far from the contrary. He got involved with a professor's wife, and she became pregnant. Remember, he is 15, possibly now 16 years old. This would be considered statutory rape on the behalf of the female nowadays, but back then it was only considered rape if the elder of the two was male. While not considered illegal, the sex scandal was still frowned upon and he was expelled from Caltech. George wanted to have a relationship with her and be part of the baby's life, but she refused. With his tail between his legs, George enrolled at Berkeley for pre-med. While attending school, Hodel was in a common law marriage with a woman named Amelia. A common law marriage is when two people exhibit the characteristics associated with marriage, cohabitation, joint finances, children, etc., but they never go through with an officiated ceremony. George and Amelia had a son, Duncan. Then he moved on to legally marry a fashion model from San Francisco, Dorothy Anthony. They also had a child together, a daughter named Tamar. George received his medical degree from the University of California in 1936. He opened a successful medical practice in LA called First Street Clinic, where he specialized in treating venereal diseases. After this, George's social status skyrocketed. He became friends with well-known photographer Man Ray and film director John Huston. These men, and many others, joined together to party, drink, and womanize. And that's putting it lightly. These men were actually sadomasochists. George married again, another Dorothy, who he called Dorero, as not to be confused with his other wife. I didn't see noted anywhere that he divorced before remarrying, and I did read he was a polygamist, so it seems as if he did have multiple wives at once. And the kicker is that Dorero was his friend John Hudson's ex-wife. Super strange. After marrying Dorero, George purchased the Sowden House in 1945. The mansion was built by the son of famous architect Frank Lloyd Wright and resembled a Mayan temple. At this mansion, George hosted many parties of all types, including orgies. George had a forbidden room that none of the children were ever allowed to enter. They had no idea what went on in there, but they always saw young women going in and out of that room with their father. What was going on in there? Was it some kind of sex dungeon? It was thought that Dr. Hodel performed abortions for women under the radar. Perhaps that took place in this room. When his daughter Tamar was 11 years old, George sexually assaulted her. He, quote, wanted to teach her how to give oral sex and forced her to perform it on him. When she was 12, George's friend, Man Ray, came over to take photos of the ever-growing Hodel family. He now had 7 children. After taking the family photos, Man stripped Tamar of her clothing and took nude photos under the watch of her father. Poor Tamar continued to be sexually abused by her father and his socialite friends throughout her teenage years. She actually became pregnant, and her father was the father. George attempted to perform an abortion on Tamar by injecting her with the tincture ergot, but that failed. However, he then sedated her and a physical abortion was completed by another doctor. Tamar ended up running away from home and staying with a friend. After a few days, she was arrested by LAPD juvenile. She told police of her father's sexual abuse, and George was arrested for incest. But at the trial, George's lawyer called Tamar a liar and said she made up the entire thing. The jury deliberated for 45 minutes and came back with a not guilty verdict. I think with enough money, you can get away with just about anything. After this, police were informed that George Hodel had ties to Elizabeth Short and should be looked into as a suspect for her murder. There were at least 8 witnesses that confirmed they knew each other. In 1950, Hodel's mansion was bugged by the LAPD. An outbound phone call was recorded. "Supposin' I did kill the Black Dahlia. They can't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead. They thought there was something fishy. Anyway, now they may have figured it out. Killed her. Maybe I did kill my secretary." His secretary, Ruth Spalding, died of a supposed overdose. You would think that recording would be enough to arrest him on suspicion of murdering Ruth, but no. As it turns out, the electronic recording devices placed in the mansion were not done legally. A couple of officers that suspected George Hodel in the Black Dahlia case broke into his mansion and bugged it. This recording they have of him is compelling, but unfortunately it cannot be used against him in the court of law. What's bonkers is that the Black Dahlia is not the only murder that George was suspected of committing. Hodel was also a suspect in the 1947 killing of Jean French, the red lipstick murder, and the 1949 killing of Louise Springer, the green twig murder. But even with his name on the list of suspects in multiple murder cases, he was able to leave mainland America. After obtaining a degree in psychiatry, he moved to Hawaii, where he counseled prison inmates for 3 years. After that, George moved to the Philippines. It's almost like he was running from something. While in the Philippines, he started a new family and had 4 more children, which makes a total of 11 little Hodels born from 5 different women. He moved back to California in 1990 and passed away in 1999 at the age of 91. No charges were ever filed against him. One of George's children, Steve Hodel, joined the LAPD when he was 22 years old. He knew of the infamous unsolved Black Dahlia case, but had no idea his father was a suspect. After George's death, Steve and his latest stepmother, June, were looking through an old photo album. Steve was drawn to a photo of a beautiful young woman with pale skin and dark hair. It finally dawned on him that the woman in the photo was Elizabeth Short, aka the Black Dahlia. This triggered Steve Hodel to start his own investigation into his father. After combing through all the evidence, he truly believes George Hodel is responsible for killing Elizabeth Short and has written several books on the subject. The Black Dahlia Avenger, 1, 2, and 3. Most Evil, 1 and 2, and The Early Years, 1 and 2. Safe to say his investigating has pretty much consumed his life since his father's death. One of the main pieces of evidence was the handwritten postcard from the Black Dahlia's killer. Steve says 100% this is his father's handwriting. However, handwriting analysis could not say the same without a doubt. To recap, the killer was thought to have a medical background as Dahlia was dissected with surgical precision. Her intestines and uterus were completely removed. Did George try to perform an abortion on Elizabeth that went terribly wrong? But if that was the case, why mutilate her and leave her out on the lawn? I guess he was a sadomasochist. Not only is George Hodel thought to be linked to the Black Dahlia, red lipstick, and the green twig murders, but many people believe he is the infamous Zodiac Killer. There is more than one composite sketch of the Zodiac Killer, but if you take a look at this particular sketch, it strongly resembles George Hodel. For everyone on YouTube, I'll have it up now. For everyone else, I will post it on social media. Plus, the Zodiac killer contacted police to bring attention to their crimes, similar to the letters and phone calls the media and LAPD received in the Black Dahlia case. Did George Hodel go on to dub himself the Zodiac before fleeing the country? I will admit that I always leaned towards George Hodel as the killer in this murder case, but after doing the research on this episode, both Leslie Dillon and Mark Hansen seem like pretty strong suspects. It has been 76 years since the Black Dahlia was murdered, and unfortunately, I think this one will remain unsolved. Let's talk about how this case has influenced pop culture. Many, many books have been written on the topic, too many to name. So let's talk about the big screen. In 2006, the film The Black Dahlia, starring Scarlett Johansson and Josh Hartnett, premiered. Where is Josh Hartnett? Can we bring him back? He was definitely one of my teenage heartthrobs. I mean, The Faculty, 30 Days of Night. So good. Anyways, this film does include Elizabeth Short's murder, but the rest is dramatization. And don't get me wrong, it is definitely entertaining and the cast is really good, so if you haven't seen it before, it is worth a watch. American Horror Story featured the Black Dahlia, played by Mina Suvari, in the 2011 episode titled Spooky Little Girl, and again in 2018's Return to Murder House. Again, these are loosely based on the murder, but include quite a bit of fabrication, similarly to how they covered the Madame LaLaurie and her attic full of tortured slaves. Gotta put the American Horror Story spin on it. In 2019, TNT put out a mini-series titled I Am the Night, a fictional drama focusing on the life of Fauna Hodel and her discovery that her grandfather, Dr. George Hodel, was the prime suspect in the Black Dahlia murder, as well as a documentary-style series, Root of Evil, the true story of the Hodel family and the Black Dahlia. And something I did not know about until researching for this case, there is a death metal band from Waterford, Michigan called the Black Dahlia Murder. They are actually quite popular. Death metal isn't my vibe, and I don't really understand the choice of name as it seems a bit insensitive, but to be honest, most band names are pretty weird. For example, Hoobastank, Butthole Surfers, even Blink-182. Sometimes there isn't a rhyme or reason to the name, and my 7-year-old thinks it's hilarious there is a band called Butthole Surfers. Anyways, this episode wraps up season 10, and I am beyond ready for some time off. I don't have a date set for the start of season 11, but I will keep y'all posted. I do have a nice case list ready to work off of, though, thanks to my listeners. Please continue to send emails with your story suggestions to killerstoriespodcast@gmail.com. Follow me on social media. I'm on Facebook and Instagram at Killer Stories Podcast, and I'm on Twitter at Killer Story Pod. In my absence, I do have some podcasts I would recommend to get your true crime fix. One being British Murders with my friend Stuart Blues. I was on last week co-hosting, so you will definitely want to check that out. Another is my friend Lorraine. She hosts Once Upon a Nightmare, a podcast reviewing horror films. I also really enjoy Murder with My Husband and Peyton's new spin-off show, Binged. Not exactly true crime, but true weirdness is Dark History, hosted by my idol, Bailey Sarian. If that name sounds familiar, she is the YouTube sensation behind Murder, Mystery, and Makeup. If you like true crime and makeup, you definitely need to check that one out. As always, thanks so much for listening. Until next time, this has been a killer story.